I'm Andreas Höhn. I'm a postdoc in the Migrant Life group. Some words of thank you to everybody attending the session, and thank you very much to the people who presented. It's been a very, very strong session, and I feel a bit like I'm at PAA or EPC already. The quality of the talks was really good. Today, I'm going to present work on fertility across the generations of immigrants and their descendants in Sweden. So we've heard a little bit about endogamous, exogamous relationships, or man versus woman, first generation versus second generation. So I will come with a Swedish perspective on this now. In case you're craving more details, the corresponding working paper has just been published on our webpage, which I would like to promote at this point. And the working paper contains much more details than I can ever present in any talk. And in particular, it contains more details on the data cleaning algorithms and the data setup. All right, and with this disclaimer, I would like to jump straight in. A few words regarding the motivation of our study. So we're studying Sweden, a country with relatively high levels of fertility today within the European context. TF1 2020 was around 1.9. Sweden has a growing foreign-born population, and at the same time, Sweden has a rapidly growing proportion of children with 1 or 2 foreign-born parents. Ben has highlighted this previously already very well. And as a result, the fertility of immigrants and their descendants becomes increasingly important for the overall demographic structure in Sweden and fertility in Sweden. And of course, having knowledge about integration of migrants and their descendants is very crucial. And here, fertility is very often used as a barometer. So what do we know about the fertility of migrants and their descendants? I will keep this really short. So first of all, the fertility of the first generation is relatively well explored. Over the last decades, several hypotheses have been developed and tested. For example, high fertility among immigrants from high fertility backgrounds have often been explained by the socialization hypothesis, or high fertility rates after migration have often been linked with the hypothesis of interrelated life events. In contrast to this, the second generation is not that well explored. And the reason for this are data constraints and the young age profile of the population. However, also for the second generation, several hypotheses have been developed. And the discourse is quite often along the lines of whether we see evidence of assimilation or segmented assimilation. So we have hypotheses and evidence, but what are the research gaps? And we think that there are 2 very obvious gaps in the literature. And the first one is the gender perspective that is missing. So most findings are based on women only, or men and women together. And the second gap is what's missing is a perspective that accounts for heterogeneity among the second generation, as we have descendants of immigrants from endogamous relationships and exogamous relationships, and they're often thrown together, as well as different country of origin backgrounds, which just adds another layer of complexity. So with our study, we explicitly address these gaps, and we raised the research question: how do patterns of fertility differ between first and second generation immigrants in comparison with the native Swedish population? And we paid a lot of attention to study all population subgroups together, differentiate the second generation into 2.0, 2.5, and further into whether the mother or the father was the migrant. And we also include the country of origin background consistently for all studied population subgroups to which this applies. And of course, all analyses here are separately for men and women. Let's have a quick look at our research design. In our study, we have a life course approach, and we use event history analysis by studying transitions to first, second, and third birth. And for this purpose, we used Swedish register data. You've heard quite a bit about the data, so I'll keep this relatively short as well. The data are routinely collected, they're administrative data, and using a unique personal identification number, we can link records across multiple registers. So for example, we can link individual level data on migration, birth histories, and so on with labor market data. And for our study, we used data from two sources primarily. First of all, the Swedish Population Register, the Register on Demographic Events, and the LISA database, which is the database on labor market outcomes, benefits, and so on for the Swedish population. From the LISA database, we used information, education, employment status, student, and unemployment benefits to control for the socioeconomic circumstances of individuals in all our analyses. So for all individuals, we created very detailed birth histories for each parity with an exact date for each birth. And this was possible as the data allowed for intergenerational linkage, which means that we can identify children and parents in the register, and we can link their information. And this intergenerational linkage also allowed us to identify detailed population subgroups and introduce the country of origin for all relevant groups. So very briefly, we distinguished between the native Swedish population, generation 1.0, generation 1.5, generation 2.0, and generation 2.5, and further into whether the mother or the father was the migrant among individuals from the 2.5 generation. After having completed this linkage, we identified our study population. So we identified all individuals who were born between 1941 and 2000, who had plausible demographic information, and who were at risk of a first birth between 1991 and 2017, which is our study period. We also corrected for overcoverage and inactivity in the register, which is typically something that emerges in administrative registers when individuals don't deregister when they leave the country, for example. And altogether, this resulted in a study population of about 5.5 million individuals. We then set up the data in long format to properly capture a life course approach here. So for this purpose, we sliced the follow-up time of all individuals into 1-year slices of time. So once this was done, we incorporated all socioeconomic variables from the LISA database using time-updated merging. And these LISA data were incorporated with a 1-year lag. So this means that the socioeconomic circumstances of a year reflect the year a baby was conceived rather than the baby being born, to rule out any issues with reverse causality here. Once all the setup and merging was done, we were able to draw upon parity-specific subsets of the data, and parity-specific subsets were needed as we have different timescales and different analyses. So for example, first birth analysis used age, second and third birth analysis used time since previous birth as a timescale. We then estimated Kaplan-Meier survival curves, and we used Cox proportional hazards models to compare birth rates across all studied population subgroups. When I talk about the Cox models, I will show hazard ratios for the population subgroups, which are controlled for all socioeconomic status covariates and period. All results of the Cox model models have the native Swedish population as a reference category, so please keep this in mind. And for the Cox model for first births, we also use time since migration as a time updated covariate. You will see this in the results to account for the fact that fertility might be particularly high shortly after arrival in Sweden. All models for second and third births were controlled for age at previous birth. And as I said, I'm going to show results only for some country of origin backgrounds. If you would like to see more details, check out the working paper. So let's have a look at some results. We studied around 5.5 million men and women, as I said, and we observed around 2.5 million births among those in the study period. As you can see, the largest population subgroups was the native Swedish population, followed by first generation immigrant groups and second generation immigrant groups. This plot now shows Kaplan-Meier curves for transition to first birth. Please bear in mind that these curves illustrate a period perspective and broad population subgroups only. Age runs across the x-axis and survival probabilities on the y-axis. As generation 1.0 represents late entries in this analysis, the survival curves were omitted here. So what do we see for all the other groups? We see that the patterns of transition to first birth were relatively similar across all studied groups, and there's not much diversity for now. And we also see that the final levels of childlessness were slightly higher among men than among women. At the same time, we see that the final levels of childlessness were lowest among the native Swedish population towards the end of the studied age range, but the difference, as I said, were relatively small. So let's have a look at results from the Cox model, and we get a really diverse picture here. So for the first generation, and let's pick men and women from Turkey as an example, we see that levels of fertility are very high, especially shortly after arrival. However, they then start to drop, but they remain higher than for natives. Surprisingly, this pattern was not consistent for all first-generation groups. So for example, for women from Southern Europe, levels were depressed and increased only slowly with time since migration, while, for example, for men from Southern Europe, we found a completely different pattern. For generation 1.5, we found that birth rates were in between the rates of generation 1.0 and the native population, but they generally tended to reflect the captured low and high fertility backgrounds, nevertheless. For all descendants of immigrants groups, we found that birth rates were relatively close to those of the native Swedish population. So generally, patterns among generation 2.0 were still somehow reflective of the first generation, while rates of generation 2.5 seem to be closer to the native population, or they did not differ at all from the rates observed among the native population, as we can see, for example, very clearly among the men that we studied. Among the 2.5 generation, levels were actually a little bit depressed, and again, patterns differed substantially between men and women. So rates among men were generally closer to the rates observed among their native counterparts than for women. So we then followed all 2.5 million individuals who had the first birth throughout the study period for transition to second birth. So this figure now shows survival curves for transitions to second birth. And as we use time since first birth as a time scale, we could include first generation immigrants in this analysis. And as for first birth, Kaplan-Meier survival curves show a relatively low amount of diversity. The trajectories were, again, very, very similar, and so were the final levels of those who transitioned. We found that slightly more than 80% transitioned to a second child throughout the study period and within the duration of the follow-up. And again, differences between men and women were relatively small here. So what did we find with respect to the Cox model and the country of origin backgrounds? For generation 1.0, we found that second birth rates were either much lower than the rates for native Swedes, or they were the same. For generation 1.5, we found that rates were in between the rates of generation 1.0 and native Swedes, but that they were a little bit depressed with the exception of men who arrived as kids from Turkey, as their hazard ratio here is above 1. For the second generation, the second birth rates were either the same or not significantly different from the second birth rates observed among native Swedes. There was one exception where we found increased second birth rates among men of generation 2.0 with a Turkish country of origin background. But apart from that, there was no clear evidence of high or low fertility backgrounds among the second generation, as they were either relatively similar to natives or they were slightly depressed. In a last step, we then followed all 1.5 million individuals who had a second birth during the study period for a third birth. So let's have a look at some Kaplan-Meier results again. In contrast to first and second births, I think it's very obvious here that we found a very high degree of diversity in the survival curves for the overarching groups. And we see very clearly that the first two, two first generation immigrant groups, generation 1.0 and 1.5, were much more likely to transition to a third child. And in contrast to this, all second generation groups were very close to the natives and the differences were rather small. So what did we find with respect to the Cox model again? With respect to the Cox model, we found a very clear return to diversity, and as we already observed for first births, but not for second births. So, and how is this diversity, how does it become obvious? So for the first generation, we found that the high and low fertility backgrounds returned to some extent among generation 1.0 and 1.5. And we also found this differentiation to return among the second generation. However, here it only really returned for generation 2.0. For example, men and women with a Turkish background from generation 2.0 had increased third birth rates in comparison with the Swedish population. And the hazard ratio here was around 1.5 or 1.6. Results for the 2.5 generation were quite striking, as with a very few number of exceptions, their third birth rates were not significantly different to the rates observed among the natives. So let's discuss these findings very briefly, and let's start with first generation immigrants. So our results very clearly underline that there is a coexistence of multiple, let's call them classic explanatory approaches. And to give some examples, so we observed very clearly an interrelation of life events. So first birth rates were especially high shortly after migration for most generation 1.0 groups. And this clearly indicates family formation surrounding migration for some country of origin groups. And in most cases, these first birth rates were particularly high among women. We also observed clear evidence for a socialization hypothesis. So for example, high fertility backgrounds remained high fertility backgrounds, which was especially visible for first and third births. And at the same time, we already observed quite some differences between generation 1.0 and 1.5, with generation 1.5 being in between natives and generation 1.0. In addition, some of our results very clearly point towards the selection. So we found low levels of fertility among some migrant groups from typically high fertility backgrounds. I actually did not show this here, but birth rates were really low among male and female immigrants from India, who typically tend to have higher birth rates, for example, in the UK context. In a small number of cases, we also found that fertility was quite depressed among some first generation immigrant groups. Very obvious was this for first birth rates among women from Southern Europe, which then increased slowly over time. So we have the reverse pattern in birth rates here. And this is the most interesting bit, actually, and this is what makes our study particularly novel, are the insights for the second generation groups. So for most second generation groups, there were large differences when compared to their first generation counterparts. So the second generation as a whole tends to be closer to the native population. And the next aspect, which needs to be seen in context with the first generation, is that there seems to be a much faster adaptation from high than from low levels of fertility. So this means that high fertility backgrounds lower the fertility faster than low fertility backgrounds seem to pick up. And at the same time, it became quite obvious, I think, during the presentation that generation 2.0 behaves quite differently from 2.5. And it seems, this might be an overgeneralization, but it seems that assimilation is more strongly pronounced among generation 2.5, as they were generally closer to natives. In contrast to this, generation 2.0 was more likely to show signs of segmented assimilation or subculture here. This points towards the fact that mixed marriages, we talked a little bit about this already during the session, are very central when it comes to the process of assimilation. One last aspect which we observed, and this requires a bit more thought and the browse through the literature, is that among generation 2.5, fertility tended to be more likely to be depressed if the mother was a migrant than the father. And in our team, we discussed already a couple of mechanisms for this, but this is something that still needs a little bit of thought and maybe the input of the audience here. And yeah, to boil our findings down into one take-home message, our study provides very strong evidence that fertility patterns among the second generation are drifting away from the patterns observed among the first generation, as they increasingly resemble patterns of the Swedish native population. And I would like to thank everybody for your attention, and I would like to hand over to Julia, the chair of the session.